we would look at the art that we discussed last week and this week. So I'm going to stop at 3 and give us a half an hour. I kind of spotted where the art is. There's a lot of it down here, and then we'll go upstairs. So
I'm sorry,
if I go too long, someone raise their hand and say, I want to try to look at my watch. But anyway, also a reminder that next week we're meeting 10:30 to 12:30 in the morning. Because I mentioned that in the first week. Because there's the Boston International Fine Arts Festival. Fortunately, I'm going to be in it, so I have to. It opens, and I have to get to Boston. So we'll do it 10:30 to 12:30.
Where's it?
It's at Cyclorama, and it's over the weekend. The opening is next Thursday night, and then it runs Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And it's galleries represented. I think there are 4 Cape galleries. One of them being Miller White Fine Arts, where I have my work, and then the other. There's some from Pennsylvania and Connecticut. I think New Jersey. So it's not just a Boston. There are galleries from New England and even maybe a little bit further. I think I saw one or two from further south. So it's their 20th, so they've been doing it for a long time. And Miller White Fine Arts is, I think the gallery has to be juried in, so they're bringing a work by I think about 5 or 6 of their artists to show at the. So that's why I have to get there. So that's why I figured we'll do it in the morning. Give me time to get everything together. Okay, so last week we didn't have all the Motherwell, and although we discussed him, I just thought we're going to see this upstairs, this piece. But there were a couple that we didn't have, and I want to show them to you. This is also in our collection, and this is his. I think we saw that last week. This is his famous elegy. He did a number of them, dozens probably, of various sizes, some as big as 10 or 12 feet wide. This is one of his collages, where there's a cheese label there, and part of it is printed, and part of it is hand cut paper that he then adds to the print. And some he just totally does collages. This is the one we didn't see. His three themes or series was the elegy and the open series, and then he does his collages. And the open series is clearly inspired by Matisse. As you can see, this wonderful red with this shape that's always in the open series, but they're all different colors. Here he's repeated it twice, and it's kind of a door in. And this particular one reminds me, there's a famous one by Matisse, I think it's at MoMA, called The Studio. And it's all red background with, elements of a studio. And it's, for some reason, this reminds me of it. But anyway, Motherwell was studying philosophy at Stanford, and he happened to see a show of Matisse when he was in California. And I think he said when he saw it, it shot through him like an arrow. So he was very impressed with Matisse. Okay, so this is Richard Flourish, who also was in Provincetown for a while. This is his stained glass, but he was very well known for his city views. And look how he uses the light. I mean, this is like a road, and light was so important to so many artists, and certainly in Provincetown. But Flourish uses it really differently, and we can see with his, even a black and white, we can see how it shimmers, and he loves to do cities, skylines, low horizon line, abstracted in some ways, but certainly, you know, realism, but not technically. And this one is right outside, and someone remarked earlier when they passed it by, how he's got that wonderful light and the shimmering, and he has these strong lines, very horizontal lines, and then he has the masts of the boats cutting through, and all this shimmering, almost rectangular shapes here. Very an interesting artist from a lot of these are prints, but he studied in Paris, and his fascination with light was very different than the Impressionists, the way he used it, but certainly quite beautiful.
And Debbie, how is he a Cape Cod artist? What's his connection?
He was in Provincetown for so
there
there
is
is
time, or
What's the time period?
well, before my time, but let me see, he died in 1979. But he did spend a lot of summers in Provincetown.
whereas Motherwell spent a lot of time in Providence.
Yes, Motherwell was there for almost 40. I think he came in 53 and he died there in 91. Probably one of the, but some of the early artists like Edwin Dickinson and Ross Moffat were there also in the early years, or Carl Knass. Many of them stayed. Edwin Dickinson was there, but then had a home in Wellfleet. So they were all, Florsheim, I don't think it was as active in the art colony as some of the others, but he was there. Roy Freed, one of the founders, along with Harry Hall of the museum. He was a lawyer and did this interesting sculpture with steel. Certainly abstract, but this is I think this one is Rising Pheasant and Flight. You have a certain abstract, but a sense of flight. He's actually not a famous artist, but I thought pretty interesting. Here's he's very influenced by Cubism, and I think it's something about woman and woman with flower. And there it is, the flower and the woman, and it certainly has a cubistic. Sometimes he used found objects, and we'll get to an artist, Bogosian, who's really, here's another piece. Nice sweep, a lot of movement. Okay, this is John Grello, who I had the opportunity, he died in 2014. I interviewed him a number of times, and he was quite an interesting artist. He had studied with Hoffman, and started out, and I'm going to just show you quickly some of his early work, which is not in the museum. He started out as an abstract expressionist. He served in the Navy during World War II, came out of the Navy, then studied in California, met, Rothko was one of his teachers, and then in 1948 he came east. He grew up in Hartford, so he was an Easterner. He came east, joined the Abstract Expressionists, and this is some of his Abstract Expressionist work. He went back and forth between Abstract Expressionism and figurative work. This was he did a series of what they call his mosaics. But none of those are in the collection. What's in the collection is at the zoo. So anyway, his themes were pretty interesting. One of his themes was the tango theme. And this is a triptych, so I'm going to show it to you in 3 pieces. And you get a sense from here how he was very interested in voluptuous and curvaceous women. And when I went into his studio, everything was painted. On one of his doors, he had a painting that, very voluptuous of Marilyn Monroe. And he did a very famous painting of Marilyn. He did a whole series of Marilyn Monroe. One of them looks like Some Like It Hot from that
Yeah.
movie. Okay, we don't have any of his Marylands. He was long time Wellfleet. He taught for 25 years at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, retired in 1991, and then lived in Wellfleet. I interviewed him a number of times when he was pretty old. He died at the age of, he died 2014, so he was 97. I think I interviewed him a year before when he was 96. And at that point he was pretty frail, but his mind was perfect. And he was, you know, went on and on about what New York was like in the 40s and where he knew exactly where he lived. He told me his address and how important Hoffman was. But there's some really good things he said that I want to quote some of his words because I think you'll really enjoy it. When I first interviewed, well, all right, so when you look at his work, what do you, I mean, look at that. When you look at his work, what is the first thing that attracts you?
Color.
Oh.
Exactly. So I said that to him, and I said, you know, and what's the mood you get?
Playful, lighthearted.
Yeah, kind of happy, yeah. So I said I asked him that. I said, you know, the color makes me feel, you know, a sense of buoyancy and kind of happy. And he said, and this is his quote, he said, the color, he says, resolves the aesthetics of a picture in one way and liberates the subconscious into a more conscious feeling. The idea is to strike a mood in how you put the colors together. They may look joyful, but they're not. I'm reaching out for something, he said to me. And then he said, he thinks a moment, and then he added, but I don't know what. And I said to him, after all these years, I mean, he was in his well into his 90s, and you still don't know what? And he was amused, and he laughed, and he said, you have to find an idea. So he was a little bit obscure about that. He did go back and forth between, I showed you the abstract art. Although he started out as an abstract expressionist, he became a figurative artist when he started teaching at UMass because he felt it was important to set a structure for the students and in representational art. Although he said if he was to do it again, he might not do that. And he taught for 25 years, and then when he retired, he moved to Wellfleet, on the same street as, on Commercial Street, on the same street as where Bob Henry and Selena Treef had it happen, a little ways down. When he was younger, when I say younger, probably 90, and I interviewed him, he took me, we started out in his house, and then there was this kind of precarious path up to where his studio was, and at 90 he could still manage it. The last time I interviewed him at 96 he couldn't, but and I'll also tell you a funny story about that. But anyway, so when we walked outside, all across his barn was this big painting of you know, musicians, and all in these flamboyant colors. And then you walked up, and then there was behind a garage, there was a painting he did that reminded him when he left the Navy, and there was an image of Eve and the serpent. And then as we walked up to right outside the studio, there were 2 trees, and he had painted these curvaceous women on the trees as if they were beckoning you to come into the studio. And in the studio were tons and tons of work. But the last time I interviewed him, and he was then 96, we didn't go, he had a studio up in his house. So, but on the staircase there was one of those elevator, you know, along the banister, that's how he got up there. So he wanted me to go up to the studio. He wasn't going to go up. He said, but you can sit on this, he said, and ride up. I didn't. I bought the stamps. But he was very funny, and there was a painting. He did these tango dancers, and okay, like that, and he had on a big painting of two men tangoing, and he said to me, "See, I'm very up to date." I got to know him. He was really, quite a guy. Anyway, he said he liked working both ways. He liked working abstract, and he continued to work abstract. He said they offer different opportunities. It doesn't matter what you paint, abstract or figurative. They each have problems to solve. You have to adjust yourself to a different way of thinking. So he said he worked very spontaneously. And he said, even if there are mistakes, I leave them. Because he said he's afraid if he tried to correct them, he'd lose the mood and the freshness. So he didn't really overwork his work. And this was this triptych. The triptych was, okay, I did it again, didn't I? Is Ben there?
Yeah, I'm here.
We covered up this. I need your help again. Okay, they like that. Yeah, what did I do? We're back again. Okay. This triptych was so if you have to image it, was outside for a while on the porch of the museum. It's gigantic and wonderfully typical. He also did circus themes. But his, whether he was doing that, I mean, this is probably a very early one. The colors are a little darker, but after he studied with Hoffman, he said Hoffman just really reinforced his interest in color, because if we remember, Hoffman was a very strong colorist. Sidney Simon. I also interviewed him. He died in '97. I interviewed him probably in the 80s, maybe early 90s. He was primarily a sculptor. He carved wood, cast bronze, shaped terracotta. And he was very active in the Provincetown Marconi. He was a member of the Long Point Gallery with Motherwell and a number of, with actually, we'll get to Carmen Cicero. But he served in World War II, and he said when he returned, abstract expressionism was in full swing, he said. But he said, all I wanted to do was paint big fat nudes. Although she isn't a big fat nude, but that's what he said. He said, I just wanted to paint big fat nudes, he said. And then he was in France studying with Brock and some of the Cubists, but he really was more interested in figurative work. And here's an interesting quote. He said his generation was divided. He said one group was connected to the past. These artists knew what they were revolting against. Another group had no connection with the past, and they didn't know what they were challenging. That latter group thought that because they were ignorant of the past, they were free. But Simon said he saw them as being trapped and limited by their lack of knowledge. And there's a lot of people that feel that art builds from the early you know, primitive or from Etruscan art or Roman art and builds to where we are today, which might be good or bad, but you know, you're standing on the shoulders of the previous generation, and he's criticizing the group that just didn't want to pay attention to what had happened before. He was, we'll see this upstairs, it's a life-size. He was a very funny man with a very dry sense of humor, and he loved puns. And this is called Headstand, and when we think about it, you know, the figure is doing a headstand, but his head is in the stand. So you know, he played a lot with that, and he said he likes some of his work to tell a story, and he likes the idea of a joke or something funny. He said if you make somebody laugh, you change their life a little bit. So, and he was very kind of had this wry sense of humor. And then he said he loves telling stories, and I suppose we can make up a story about that. Those are the only two pieces in our collection. He says there's nothing better than telling a good story. He said, why should my writer friends have all the fun? But he also worked with architects and did some very big commissions. And this is the Four Seasons Fountain in New York, which was done in 1989. And he did another large piece in Philadelphia. And he said it's completely different working with architects than in the art world. And he wasn't happy about working with gallery directors, he said, because they love redundancy and want you to repeat yourself because they latch on to what sells. So if you've done something and it's selling, they just want you to repeat yourself. And he said, how many landscapes can you paint? How many still lifes? Art must always be changing, otherwise it becomes boring. So he was able to vary his work. And he said, I'm a maverick. If the wind blows one way, I go the other. So he was an amusing man. I interviewed him in the studio, and just the one time.
Now, was he in P-Town just for summers?
Yes.
And then where did he really work? In New York?
Most of the artists that were in P-Town, except maybe the early artists, or the Fine Arts Work Center fellows now, and some of them stay, but most of the artists, except the early ones like Moffat and Dickinson, Carl Knass, people like that, it was summers. Provincetown they were New York. Yeah. And there is a real strong New York Provincetown connection as opposed to Boston. Right. And we're going to talk about that a little later, about the conservatism of Boston. Right. And somehow some of the artists really shied away from some of the modernists really shied away from that conservatism. And Provincetown being nearby, they could go there, and here was this place where anything goes, and you weren't judged, and there was a real strong tradition of modernism from the early 20th century, and a number of artists, Lawrence Cooperman and a few other artists, just really fled Boston because of the conservatism. And as a result, I think I mentioned this before, as a result, the Boston Museum has a pretty staid collection of art. They don't have a very large collection of post-World War II art because a lot of museums are dependent upon the collectors who are going to give them the art, and the collectors were not collecting more modern. There was this conservative trend for a long time, and I don't know if it's still there. There was for example, for many years, when I was working at the Cape Cod Times, I was covering all the museum and the MFA shows, and it way before I wrote the Provincetown book, I was bewildered by the fact that here was a major museum that had in its backyard the art colony, which was, you know, National Trust for Historic Preservation said, nation's oldest, longest running art colony. It's right in their backyard. They never did a show. You know, they had the curators, they had the researchers, they had all the resources to do a fabulous show, and they never did it.
They did a big Blanche LaSalle show.
Yes, but that was like a little section, and I covered it. But why didn't they do the whole? I mean, they could have done the whole art colony, going from Hawthorne up to Motherwell and up to the Abstraction.
But they're waiting for you to put that together.
I actually mentioned it a couple of times, it was totally ignored. Because I would go to the press previews and I'd see one of the curators, and Ted Stebbins, I said to him, he's not there anymore, I said he was the curator of American art, and I suggested, I even think I wrote a letter once. And even before I wrote the book, so it had nothing to do with me, it had to do with Provincetown, what they should have been doing. But Chris McCarthy has said, who's the director of the PAM, she has said that she has better dealings when she wants to borrow a piece for a show. She has better relations with New York museums than she does with the MFA. Although there's probably not many pieces she wants from the MFA. But anyway, that's what she had told me. I don't know if that's changed or not, but that's what she did say. As we drive into Boston, everybody sees the gas tanks with Corita Kent's colors.
Yes.
And so we have several pieces of her work. She was a nun, and she worked primarily in silkscreen or serigraphs, which is a printmaking that Andy Warhol really developed. But Ken was doing it even before Andy Warhol, and it's basically using not necessarily a silk screen, but a mesh scene on a mesh cloth on a frame, and doing and people use it for t-shirts and things, and doing a design or drawing or something, and then covering all the holes except for the drawing or what you want to print with something that doesn't hold the ink, so it clogs the holes, and then you ink it with a squeegee, and then you print it. And it's a commercial printing process too. But Andy Warhol made it into a fine art. And Corita Kent used it. And she used a lot of the same things, because she used, and we don't see this so much in the pieces we have here, but she would use newspaper clippings or song lyrics. And because she was a nun, there was a lot of religious kind of or spiritual messages that she was trying to impart. And she did designs for posters. She did the 1985 U.S. Postal Service love stamp. She was a nun in Southern California, and around her were a circle of people like John Cage and Bookmaster Fuller. But she left, in 19X, she left the order because of her progressive and social and political views, and she moved to Boston. And her works are really pretty modern, I think, really nice. This is the sacrifice of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and instead there's the goat that they end up sacrificing. So a lot of her had biblical. Fritz Boltmann, interviewed him also. He died in 1985, so I must have interviewed him like somewhere in the early 80s. Very involved in the Provincetown Art Colony. He studied with Hans Hoffman. Hans Hoffman was, I think I may have mentioned this before, Fritz when he was about 17 years old, went to Germany to study at the Bauhaus School. And he had studied at the new Bauhaus in Chicago, and he then wanted to go to Germany and study the Bauhaus School. Excuse me, when he got there, Hitler had closed it. And he ended up rooming with Hans Hoffman's wife. He was a boarder with her. But Hoffman had already come to the United States, and he was teaching at UC Berkeley. When Bultmann came back to the United States, he studied with Hoffman, and Hoffman, he always said, was like a father to him. He loved Hoffman and was very influenced by his work. This is the only piece we have in the collection. He did these collages of, he painted paper with gouache, which is a opaque water-based paint, and then he cut the pieces out, kind of like Matisse's papier-collé, and he did these interesting abstract works. His influence was, he did a lot of life drawing, so he was very interested in a woman's body and the curves, and also he was very influenced by the water and the waves in Provincetown. And I think this is called Blue Yoke, but it certainly has that sense of a wave. This piece is at the in the collection of Pam, and I've seen it a number of times. And it's interesting how he uses these little diamond or squares and the movement he's able to achieve.
Is that one a collage also, the one of Pam?
Yes. And this is a piece of his sculpture that was recently shown. And also you have that sense of a wave or even the curve of a woman's body. Anne Packard's daughter, one of her, Cynthia Packard, used to model for him, and Cynthia was very influenced by Fritz, who she also said was like a father to her. And when she was like a teenager or in art school, she would model for him. And Fritz was always doing life drawing. He was very, very interested in that. Okay. Am I going too fast?
No.
Okay. Just stop me and ask a question. Okay. Okay. Here is Gil Franklin, also connected to Provincetown. He and Michael Mazur were co-directors of the Fine Arts Work Center for a while. We don't have any works by Michael Mazur, which is a shame. And maybe at one point I'll show you some. The museum doesn't have any works by him. He's a really very fine artist, very connected to Provincetown, was at Long Point Gallery, but also very active at the Fine Arts Work Center. Michael did a printmaking program at the Work Center, and helped really develop their print shop, which is now, I don't know, they have several presses now, and I think a lot of that's a result of Michael, but it's not in the collection. But he and Gil Franklin were co-directors of the Fine Arts Work Center, and this piece is upstairs, New England Woman, which is a bronze. He was very influenced by Greek and Roman and classical sculpture, but he kind of, and certainly with this piece, you have a sense that it's almost like a remnant from another time that has been broken or the arms are gone, or even when you look at this one, but it's called New England Woman. And it has this, I don't know, I don't want to, tell me kind of, I see something in it, but maybe someone else will before I say what I see in it.
It kind of has a sort of prim and proper,
Yes.
conveys a prim and
Yeah.
proper mode of
New England,
desire,
exactly.
Puritan,
Yeah, Puritan or an austerity that you
Spiritual,
see.
shaped like a cross almost.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
She's not voluptuous.
But all plain.
on the ship.
And we'll see that upstairs. He also did public commissions. He did the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington and a Harry S. Truman Memorial. So a lot of these sculptors like Sidney Simon and Gil Franklin, Hiram Gross, who we saw last week, did a lot of, a lot of their work is related to public, large pieces that they would do. This is Taro Yamamoto. He actually was born in Hollywood, but he was educated in Japan. He came back to California. He studied with Hoffman. I think I mentioned to you Hiram Gross, who didn't study with Hoffman, but knew Hoffman, sometimes would sit in on some of his lectures, said every second person every second artist that you know studied with Hans Hoffman. Hoffman, because he had school in New York and Provincetown for over 20 years. Thousands of artists came out of the school, and many of them were very famous, and as we'll see later on, did very different work, which was part of why he was so important at, teaching. Because he taught certain principles, but then he really encouraged the students to do their own thing. So they would do something like this, but then they would do, more figurative or representational work as well. And unlike Henshey, who said, this is what you do, and you don't do anything else. So Hoffman was a totally different approach. So anyway, he was, Yamamoto was in Provincetown. He started out as an abstract expressionist. And this painting, we think of drips that Pollock and speckles. I mean, this is a pretty interesting painting.
Is this one of ours?
We have this?
I'm sorry?
Is this one that belongs to the museum?
Yes, these are, I'll try to make sure I tell
Okay.
you when they don't. Okay. The ones the abstract works of Grello were not in the collection. Okay, I think most of what we're seeing now is so these are all in our collection. And you're going to see that upstairs too. Now that is very Hoffman-esque, because in his late period, Hoffman got really interested in playing these rectangles over this other work, and that's Yamamoto. Again, and this is, actually this one is upstairs. I think we looked at it before, but we'll look at it again. So you see the abstract expressionists, the gestures underneath, and then these played against these rectangles with this color. So you have this geometric shapes played against this kind of free form gestures. Interesting contrast. And you get a sense of space, because those rectangles come forward. Of course, we talked about the two-dimensional surface, but and Hoffman was interested in creating a sense of volume. And certainly because of colors or shapes, they come forward, and other things kind of go. This is clearly shows you a sense of space and volume. Okay, this is the only painting we have by Sidio from Loonie. It is typical in style, and we'll see it upstairs. It's very thickly painted. I interviewed him in his Wellfleet studio, and here are some more typical of what he did. And you can't really get the impression, because if you look at the bark, you could see it's very thickly painted. You almost reach out and touch it. It's so, it's almost sculpturesque in the way he painted. He was a very interesting man. I interviewed him. He was a Long Point artist as well, and he had a house in Wellfleet, and when I went to interview him, he said, "You'll never find it. I'll meet you at the parking lot in the center of town, and I'll take you there." And we got there, and it was, I probably wouldn't have found it. It was on a dirt road and back, you know, kind of in the woods. And it was on Higgins Pond, and there were woods all around, and all these pickerel weeds, and you know, kind of floating in the water. And he took me to his house, and then we walked down to his studio, and his wife, Nora Spire, they were both painters, both part of Long Point. And when we go upstairs, we'll see that Long Point photograph in the little Ocean Edge gallery, and they're both in it. And they both painted different subjects, but they both painted with some very thick paint. And they put it on these paper plates, and one was at one end of the studio and the other was at the other end. So when we got into the studio, he was painting a pond view, and he said he didn't need to be outside to paint it because he retained the image. And here's, I want to quote some of the things he said because they're interesting. He said, "When you observe a great deal, your mind becomes photographic. Most of painting is intuition. It isn't just what you see. It's all the senses. It's the wind on my arms. It's the smell of the salt air, the sounds of nature, and it's all the knowledge you've accumulated since you were a child." And he said he couldn't, he painted Higgins Pond and the woods over and over and over again. And he said when he traveled, although there were beautiful scenes, he couldn't paint them because he wasn't invested in it. He was invested here, he could feel it. He liked the feel of the weight of the paint. That when we asked about why he painted so thickly, he said year after year he painted the same scenes over and over again. And he said we can't help it. We only have 1 acre. And that 1 acre with 2 ponds, a meandering brook, and a forest of trees was the subject of hundreds of his paintings since the 50s, which he lived in a summer house in Wellfleet since the 50s. Again, New York in the winter. And you could see this, this light coming out. And although this is the only piece we have, which is not typical, the paint itself, the way he painted it, is typical of. And he talked about it after he got out of the service. He went to New York, and everybody was, again, it was abstract expressionism, but he said he couldn't get into it, except if you zero in, and of course this is small, but if you zero in on one section, and we'll maybe do this when we go upstairs with this one, and just zero in on one section, it's almost like a little abstraction because of the way he applied the paint, with kind of dabs and thick colors. So although this is not an abstraction, there's sections of it that you could almost see as an abstraction. And more so, I think, with these other works.
Was he using a knife a lot or brushes?
No, I don't think so. As I remember, there were a lot of brushes,
Okay.
but he could have been using a knife. No, because they weren't using much of a medium in their paint. You know, they were using that paint almost, you know, mixing it slightly with a medium, but it was coming out thick. And it was very, another thing he said, you know, he said that he just had this 1 acre. He said, but after all, he said, nature's endless. He said, Cézanne had his Mont Saint-Victoire, and he said, I have my Higgins Pond. And he said it's about experiencing a place, living in it day in and day out, watching, feeling until you understand where you are. He said all the elements, fog, sunshine, and the dampness of rain aroused him. The entire atmosphere took over my senses, which is why I couldn't, this is why he couldn't paint beautiful places when he traveled, because he wasn't immersed in it. he needed to be, this was his place, this was Higgins Pond. And he said when he came to New York, he said he just didn't catch the fever of abstract expressionism. He said, at that point, he said, I had become a masterful mechanic, but rendering a good proportion of a horse's leg wasn't going to do it for me. I was very involved in releasing my feelings, but not as an abstract expressionist. But releasing my feelings didn't necessarily mean throwing paint. Which was kind of a knock at the abstract expressionists. However, he was at Long Point with Motherwell and some of the others, so you really, I would have loved to have sat in on some of their meetings. Because they had a, okay, so this is Leonard Baskin, a figurative, obviously, graphic artist. He had a press, the Gehenna Press. He issued about 100 books through that press. He did a lot of wood engravings. This was one of his mediums, and he did them of famous writers and artists. I don't know if these are written, but obviously he did them. They were Millet, Rousseau, Courbet, Thomas Eakins, William Morris, and Camille Corot. So obviously he did them from photographs or some other. He also did Native American and Old Testament and Greek mythology, but I think he's best known for these wood engravings. How many people saw the Harry Hall show? Everybody here, just about? You hung it, right? So he was, along with Roy Feig, the founder of the museum, and everybody probably knows Scargo Pottery, which is a little oasis of, every time we have guests come, visitors, I always take them there, because you go there, and he was very interested in, he had studied with in Oregon, he had met this Japanese potter, Shoji Hamada, who was a Zen Buddhist. And Harry got very interested in Buddhism and spiritual things. And he created Scargo Pottery with that in mind. And I think you felt that when you walked through it. It was in this wooded area, and there was all this wonderful art. He was primarily known as a potter, but he did very interesting other work, and he did paintings. Certainly cubistic. His father-in-law was Geisbuehler. That's outside the museum as you walk in that case. I think it's still there. This one is, I think, his daughter's.
It was some word for us.
And they're all, several of them are potters. Sarah Hall's a painter, and, does mostly painting now. So they all followed, and Geisbuehler was their grandfather. Robert Beecham. We're getting into some more modern. He started out as an abstract expressionist, but he moved very quickly into figurative expressionism. So abstract expressionists began their revolution in the 40s, after World War II, and through the 50s. And in the 50s, mid-55, 56, there was a gallery called the Sun Gallery in Provincetown, and it was a group of artists that were rebelling against the abstract expressionists and wanting to do connect back to the real world in some way, but not in what you would call a typically realistic way. And Robert Beecham was part of that Sun Gallery in the 50s. People like Red Grooms was there, Klaus Oldenburg, Alex Katz. They were all in Provincetown showing, in many cases, most of them were showing had their first show there. So Beecham being one, so although he moved into, and these works are all in the collection, although he moved into figurative expression, you can see the expressive aspect of it. So when you look at these, let's see, these faces, I'm trying to think if there's any, okay. Does that remind you of any other artists? Anybody?
What was the question?
Yeah.
Picasso?
What was the question again?
Oh, does Beecham and his female faces, okay, and look at this one. This is as a man, but do the faces remind you of any other artist?
That looks like Trump.
I watch too much TV.
Well, I think it was before Trump's time. I say Kooning. Kooning is for
The Kony.
Well, he's not in the collection, but he's a famous abstract expressionist.
Picasso.
Kooning,
The Kony. We said that. No, we didn't.
yeah. We don't have any de Koonings, but he did those kind of grotesque women. He did a whole woman series. Anyway, Beecham reminds me a little bit of de Kooning. Certainly his color, he said in the early 50s he was, I did not interview him, but in the early 50s he hung out at the Cedar Tavern in the Village, which was a big hangout for the abstract expressionists. And the family, I think the family is what we'll see upstairs. I'm pretty sure that's the one. Obviously, there are, in the book, there's more than 300 pieces of art. In the exhibition, I think Dee Dee said she got all 121 artists represented in the exhibition, but I don't know how many pieces. Maybe there are 100 pieces, maybe a few more. I guess at least 120, but probably a few more. But not all of the pieces that we're seeing are upstairs in the exhibition. His paintings, as you can probably see, were heavily encrusted. He spattered paint, he layered it, he poured it, he did all kinds of things, a lot of the things that the abstract expressionists did. But he was into showing figures, and they're kind of psychedelic almost, and you know, it's like he was on acid or something when he did.
Looks like he's working with poster paint.
I don't know if people, we haven't talked about what you like and what you don't like, and maybe if we have some time, because we do. I really do want to stop at 3 so we can go upstairs, but there's only a couple more, so then maybe we'll talk about what we liked and what we didn't like, because art is subjective, totally. This is another piece by him, which is very different. His you know, these are kind of odd animals, and they kind of, there's no sense of, everything just flies through space. There's no gravity here. Even when you go back and look at this, they're just all clustered together.
Maybe he was on a trip.
That's called the family.
Acid trip.
A dysfunctional one.
The Osborns.
Is this the one we think looks like Trump?
No.
Yeah, you know, it doesn't. Well, he didn't know Trump. Well,
The colors are a little bit Selena Treefish in that.
Oh, yeah.
I
Pretty
like the
bold.
colors, some of his colors.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, let me see if he studied with Hoffman. Did he study with Hoffman? He must have. Yes, he did. He studied with Hoffman. As Ambrose said, every second art should name. So even if you don't know, you could say he studied with Hoffman.
Who would know?
Is that a portrait of the Kooning? That,
No, it
You know
could
who
be,
that
but
is?
what is it?
It looks like
White hair, the shock of white hair.
white hair.
Blonde
No,
white hair.
there's a self-portrait, the family, and then untitled male portrait.
Well, then that's
So-
first, we don't know.
But actually, it looks a little bit like the Kooning.
that's,
doesn't
I'm just looking at that.
it? Okay, this is totally different. This is Varusian Bogosian, who is 90 years old this year. There was a show at Berta Walker Gallery this summer called, she called it the Gay 90s. I think that's what she said, Gay 90s. And Bogosian and Carmen Cicero, who we're going to get to next, were in the show. Both are longtime Provincetown Art Colony artists, very different. So Bogosian does these assemblages and constructions, and some are very, we'll go through them very quickly, and then I want to talk a little bit about him. This is Rose Celavie. This is Why Not? So, as you would guess, Mr. Bogosian, people call him Bugsy. I never could bring myself to call him Bugsy. The first time I interviewed him was in the late 70s. He was having a show again. He was a Long Point artist. He was having a show there. And we arrived, and he was very concerned about, he was 68 at the time. And he said he could hardly believe it. He said, time flies and all that. To think 70 in 2 years. So he said, all of a sudden it comes on you, and time, past and present, as we're going to see and learn, is a constant theme in his work. But the time element in his art does not have to do, he said, with a sense of mortality, but with timelessness. And then he said, and he was still kind of hanging the show, and he was busy, and he said, time is short, we got to get to work. And he started moving these constructions around, because some of them are, you know, they're wood, some are on paper. And he was a teacher at a number of schools, but the most recent one was Dartmouth College. And a photographer came to photograph him, and it was going to be on the cover of Cape Week. And so Bogosian said, okay, so what do you want me to do? And he was wearing these khaki shorts and shoes and socks and, you know, a shirt. And he laid down, I wish I could do it, but I won't. He laid down on the floor like an odalisque. And we shot the picture, and it ran on the cover of Cape Week. So that gives you a sense of who Bogosian was. He was, again, a very, not outright laugh out loud funny, but had this kind of dry sense of humor. So his work was made up of a collection of things, and these are on paper with writings, and what he did, he scavenged antique shops, flea markets, yard sales. Some of the things he used in his, I want to give you an idea, antique toys, bells, diagrams and pictures from old books, old photographs, tools, mannequins, little miniature mannequins, wheels, and he even these 10 pins, blocks, old children's blocks he would use, and he put them together in these kind of unpredictable ways, ambiguous, paradoxical, mysterious, and he said it was about reaching back to memory or myth. And he said nothing is really thrown away. Memory is never thrown away. And that's how he felt about what he was doing. He was kind of ecological. He was preserving all the stuff that had been thrown away and putting and assembling it into his work. He was also influenced by poetry. And so, okay, we're going to go back to this one. This is to Magritte. So it's called, what was it called? Something for Magritte. Now, Magritte was a surrealist artist, and you could see he used these blocks, and this is this hand from a mannequin, and this looks like a tool of some kind. But some of his work was a quick take. There's one piece I saw which was portrait of an artist, and it was on paper, and it was a horse. Very obviously, the back of the horse was there, and it was saying a kind of horse's ass or something, and that was so. Some of his work was a quick take, and others was very mysterious. Now, I know a little bit about Magritte, but I can't figure this out. One of the others, so you know, he was very influenced by Dada and Surrealism, and he was poetry and art also. William Butler Yeats, T.S. Eliot were influences on his work. I mean, the why not is a easy, you know, it's there. But some of his other work you really have to work at. And he did this Rose C'est la Vie, which is here, and that relates to Man Ray's photograph of Duchamp dressed kind of as a woman, and it was Rose, R-R-O-S-E, C'est la vie, like a name, but it was a play on Eris, French, C'est la vie. So he did, and this is Rose C'est la vie blimp. So it's a play on Man Ray's photograph of Duchamp.
But only you would know.
But if you didn't know that,
Yeah, only you would know that.
what would you do? So he was a pretty interesting guy. I had some things he said that, you know, he was, some of them are riddles. You know, you have to look at them and say, okay, what's this all about? He was, didn't interview him. He was 90 this year, and he had some heart surgery. I hear he's doing really well. But the last time I interviewed him, which was, I don't know, he was in his 80s, he was, very robust. But at 90, I interviewed him at 83 again. He was 83 at that time. First I interviewed him at 68, and then he was 68, and then 83. He came to Provincetown first in 1948, and with some artists who wanted to study with Henry Henchy, but he decided he wasn't going to. I guess Henchy wasn't his cup of tea. Anyway, he ended up working in restaurants, he said, and doing a lot of beachcombing, and that was the beginning of his work in assemblage, putting, things that he collected together. He talked about abstract expressionism, and again, he was at the Long Park Gallery with Motherwell. He said, abstract expressionism diminished the big flair of Europe. That's not saying they still weren't putting on great shows of Picasso and Braque, but our boys got to be big time. And I think I remember last week we talked about the fact that Motherwell said that if it wasn't for the war, Peggy Guggenheim had that gallery, Art of the Century Gallery, in the early 40s, and he said if it wasn't for the war, she would have been bringing some of the European artists to show, but because of the war, and most of them were in Paris or had come here, she couldn't get them, and that's why she ended up showing these kind of rebellious young abstract expressionists, so she had a lot of influence. And then there were art critics like Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg who really sang the praises of that art movement. I think Clement Greenberg at one point said, if it wasn't abstract art, it wasn't important. He was almost like Henchy saying, it wasn't impressionism. So we could spend a lot of time trying to figure these out.
We could ask them.
And there's some down here. We'll start down here. Okay, this is Carmen Cicero. As I said, he was also 90 this year. And I got to know Carmen pretty well. He, you wouldn't know it if you met him. You would never guess he's 90. I saw him this summer. I go back with him maybe 15 years. He always seemed like 20 years younger than his chronological age. Very energetic and loved to talk. So anyway, I interviewed him when he was having a show again at Long Point. And he has a house in Truro, and he divides his time between a loft on the Bowery in New York and this house in Truro, which was the former South Truro Railroad Station. So that's his house, and he even has the sign from the station when the railroad stopped there. It's in the woods, but the railroad ran there. And I interviewed him before he got, in 2009 he got a grant a $90,000 grant from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and he built this really fantastic studio on the property. I interviewed him before that, probably in 2000, I'm guessing. His wife is Mary Abel, who was a professor, art history professor at Dowling College. She just retired. I also did, there's a book, monograph of his work, and I wrote one of the essays, spent a long time with him in New York, interviewing him. So got to know him pretty well. Kind of a compact man, curly gray hair. He's also a jazz musician. He plays the saxophone. And he was in Provincetown. I think he was playing with I think he might have been playing with Bart Wiseman this summer. So he, you know, he does these little gigs here and there. I mean, he's primarily an artist. He said he started out as an abstract expressionist. He actually studied with Motherwell and Hunter College. And he said, when I first saw the work of abstract expressionists, I was beguiled with the audacity. Where did they get the chutzpah, the originality, the courage for this powerful gesture? So he was in graduate school at Hunter College, and he studied with Motherwell and later became part of the Long Point Gallery. So he was doing, he said in the 40s, if you were doing narrative works, you were just out of fashion. So he said he joined the club and he became an abstract expressionist, and he was in 6 Whitney museum shows, group shows, with the abstract expressionists. But he said, at a Whitney annual exhibition, you'd see the same gang, Motherwell, Klein, de Kooning, and off to the side was Edward Hopper. And Hopper would ultimately, he said, outshine 90% of the guys who were abstract expressionists. And this is from a guy that did this kind of work early on. So he started out as an abstract expressionist, and then his work became figurative. This kind of very kind of cartoony but violent, a lot of conflict. I should have read this. After he said that, he said, you can't take away the notion that abstract expressionism was a significant movement, one of the great things that happened in the United States. So he qualified the Edward Hopper thing by going on to say that. So these in the 70s, these were his paintings, this one and this one, and they're really full of, I mean, it's serpent, they're really violent. Well, I mean, what do we see in these?
Kind of Joseph Campbell, mythological, subconscious, primeval.
Yeah, I mean, and this is very typical of the work. He said he was doing this work while he was going through a divorce.
That explains it.
And he said also,
That's true, isn't it? Yep.
his studio burned down he had a studio in Englewood, New Jersey. And that was 1972. And he said it was a date scorched in his memory. Obviously, he lost everything, he said, all of his paintings. He said artists would, this was before the fire, he said artists would come into my studio and they literally thought I was crazy, loony. Everybody was an abstract expressionist, and here I was painting pictures that looked a little like cartoons.
Could
So
this
he was
be
kind of aware of what he was doing.
Could this be around the time maybe A Clockwork Orange came out? Maybe Kubrick had an influence or something?
I'm
like
sorry.
that? I'm just wondering maybe if it came out around the same time as A Clockwork Orange and Stan Kubrick's influence,
yeah, it would have
possibly?
been, yeah. He didn't talk about that. Although he was a real movie buff.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to show you some of the work that we don't have in the collection, and some of his themes that are really very interesting, because his work changed a lot. So after he joined Long Point in 1977, which was pretty much the beginning of the gallery ran for about 20 years, and it was the most prestigious gallery in Provincetown in its time, mainly probably because Motherwell was part of it, but all of the artists around Motherwell were represented in collections in major museums. So it was, so we talked about, so then he moved into this work that, in the 90s, his work became, and this is, these are not in the collection. This, I want to keep this. This one is, it's called Tracer of Lost Persons, and it was influenced by apparently a radio show in the 1930s, and it began in the 30s, and it went for a long time, and it was called Mr. Keen, Tracer of Lost Persons. And it reminds me of a 40s Humphrey Bogart you know, with the guy with the hat and the walking, and that figure is in several of his works. He repeats that figure. There's one of him, it's called the Van Rysdal Enigma, and it's this little figure walking in a painting of a Van Rysdal type painting. This little car, kind of looks like a little Volkswagen, is very, again and again. And it's this little car in the woods, all alone, very mysterious. And in one of them, this is the piece that you'll see upstairs, it's in the collection, which represents his present work. He did a lot of these kind of Truro roads, and there is this kind of owl-like creature. And you'll look at the work, it's very exacting, and you look at the feathers and the eyes. And his work is very exacting, but it's not realistic. It's very mysterious. So when we were talking, I said, you know, when I looked at these works, there's like a story here. I could make up a story. And he said, no, he didn't think they were narrative. He said, I'm positive that's correct. It's, that it's not a narrative. He said, it's a visual experience. A narrative would be a story. He doesn't see the story aspect, although the first time I interviewed him, I was there for 2 hours. He's a great storyteller. He has stories from, I mean, the conversation, you know, started with art, but it went to movies and jazz, and when I interviewed him for the book, when we were in his loft, it was just he just rambled. I mean, not incoherent or anything like that, but he just went all over the place. He's very well read, and I'm going to read you some of his quotes that are really pretty interesting, and talks about music and literature and art and how important that is. So he said he sees them. He calls his work visionary. And he said he doesn't see the story aspect. He sees his pictures, he says, as confounding, enigmatic, haunting, unlikely, evocative, provocative. And he said some of them are almost horror and comedy mixed together. And you could see that. So, this work that you went from this strong colors, very, very violent, to this more calmer, meditative work, but certainly still kind of haunting. It's not happy like Grello. So I asked him about this guy here. So I asked him who he was. Because I said, oh, he reminds me of in a Humphrey Bogart film. And he said, I think it's me. But I don't want to be really overly literal. You know, it's a way of thinking about a person as he goes through life. By the way, this is like self-analysis, which could be a lot of baloney, as we both know. And frankly, I don't care if it is baloney or not. These are thoughts that I have in my head. We can think of ourselves going through life as event after event, or striding through life, or floating through life, or whatever. So that it could be a symbol of me. The impressions that I get are things I love to paint. So mostly what I paint is what I'd like to actually see. And that's the car thing. There's a really wonderful painting of the same little car on this kind of isolated, probably Truro road. And this car has its headlights on. Well, the car, it's called, the painting is called The Bookkeeper. And the car doesn't have its headlights on, but the lights are on in the car. And there's this kind of bespectacled bookkeeper type in it. And there's one painting where there's a car, it looks like it's escaping from a house down this road. So he loves this little car, and he puts it in all kinds of scenarios that I think you could tell a story with them, but he said no. They're what I want to see. So it's difficult to characterize his work. It's figurative, but it's not realistic. Although the work is, you know, the work is pretty meticulous. When we look at it up close, the shadows and the feathers on the owl, I mean, they're meticulously painted.
Yes.
And this is an acrylic painting. So it's kind of interesting how he does this. He thought of the work as enigmatic, and he said the enigma is not to keep you away, but to draw you in. And so here he has some interesting things, but he said overall, a painting is about the aesthetics, and if it works as a composition, whatever else it says. But then he wanted to talk about the work of other artists, and he says, and Torkov said this too, if you remember, he said, it's not what's new, it's what's good. In other words, so much of art today is not duplicating what went before to do something different, and that's what often gets the attention. And he says, so, it's not necessarily what's new, it's what's good. And that's in the eye of the beholder. He said the significant thing about art is that you're revealing a new vision of reality. Now you might say that seems slightly inconsistent with what I said a moment ago, but it really isn't. So it's a new vision of reality, but in his interpretation it has to be good. And then he went on to talk about some other artists, and he raved about Picasso and Hopper and Monet, but he said he wasn't sure about Warhol. He said those who knew how to achieve fame got fame. And this might not have had a hell of a lot to do with art. Except, if you really want to get very cynical, you could say pop artists represented the times because the times were all about fame and money, and they were making works about fame and money. I can be an opinionated guy, but I can't really develop an opinion about Andy Warhol. A part of me dislikes him very much, although I love his drawings. Another part of me says, hey, you got there. You found a way to get to the top, and you did offer something historically significant, I think. So I have a hard time adding it all up. He kind of doesn't like his art, but I guess he respects it. Motherwell said the same thing about that when the abstract expressionists were starting out, they were just happy if a gallery would show their work. And who taught them about marketing their work were the pop artists, Warhol being probably the most famous, but they knew how to deal with the galleries. And you know, today if you look at the auction prices, Warhols are certainly outpricing Motherwells. So then we got we went on to talk about music, and he said some interesting things that relate to art in general. He said he had studied the clarinet and the saxophone, and he played the alto sax. And then he said music gives you thrills up your spine. Painting does as well, but with music it's more visceral, particularly if you're playing it. And he saw a commonality among the arts. He said the great arts, when they reach a sublime level, produce a magical atmosphere and a spell that is extraordinarily thrilling. You get this in ballet. I get it in literature. I get it with Joseph Conrad, Thomas Hardy, Herman Melville. And there are certain artists, Albert Pinkham Ryder, Edward Hopper Monet, where you get that visual resonance. So here he was talking about the arts, talked about literature, music, and he was, he played jazz, but he was very knowledgeable about classical music. And obviously he was reading Thomas Hardy and Herman Melville and Joseph Conrad. So he was pretty worldly and sophisticated. But if you would meet him, he was just like a fun guy. He really was a fun guy. You would walk into his studio and he was all, Pat, I did a studio tour how many years ago?
Oh.
So you met Carmen.
Oh yeah, he was something else. I did like to talk, but is it wrong to say that some of his work, maybe a little bit this one, but the one with the Dick Tracy type figure, kind of surrealistic to some extent?
Oh yeah, or
And-
yes.
And when you saw a whole lot of these more current
Yes.
ones, you really were
Yeah, they are surreal. They're haunting.
very haunting.
Yeah, I think that's the feeling I get. I find them really. I mean, I'm not crazy about these other works.
But it sort of contradicts his personality when you meet him.
Yeah, these.
Right? I mean, he didn't have a blunted personality.
No. He was very alive and he was a lot of fun. He was laughing all the time, and he, I don't know if I actually saw him this summer, but I spoke to him on the phone several times, and he knew about. I don't know if I should call him and make sure he gets to see the show. I don't know, and he may have already. I don't know, but I may need to remind him. But he's usually here through the fall, and his wife was teaching, and used to go back to teach. This time of year prior, and he used to stay, but now he said they're going to stay longer because she retired. So they're going to be here. So they're probably still here. I'll give him a call. Okay, I'm almost gonna do it. And just one more artist who I don't know a lot about. Edward Joby. He also was at Long Point. We only have one piece, and that's it. He does a lot of different things. He actually had a show here a few years ago. He also does something like this. This is a painting I saw at the Murder Walker Gallery this summer. So he does that, and that, and that's it. So you can see a big, he does collages, interesting juxtapositions, a variety of work. He is influenced by, let's see, Baroque art, Italian Futurism. The drawing that you see here is a drawing and kind of mysterious. Two figures. I would say he's not one of my favorite artists. So it's just 3 o'clock. Do we want to, and then we can talk about some of what we liked as we go around, and we'll start down here because there's actually a lot of pieces down here, and then we'll work our way Yes, they have a great selection. So that's Corita, it's a serigraph. Real strong colors. She used a lot of clippings, and you can see some letters in here.
Yes.
But she oftentimes would do clippings and words, and there were a few, I don't know, those words mean it.
I was trying to see if there was an actual word separated.
That looks like a no.
That's Sister Corita.
I just see this kind of abstract.
Oh, there's a figure there. There's a
There's a
face and
Yes,
a body.
yeah.
Photographed by his wife.
Remember on that?
Just look different.
It does.
Yeah. People practice going out the road.
Oh, and here's the sacrifice of Abraham. They put a lot of the works on paper down here. And here's a Will Barnett. And we'll get to Robert Vickery, but you can see, remember we talked about negative spins? Look at the shades of blue or how, you know, or it's all very flat.
He must be very interested in architecture.
That's Will Barnett.
Yeah, it looks like a dressing room.
Yeah, we talked about him last week. Next to Corita Kent.
That's right.
I happen to like his work a lot. He's so interesting. There's a big one. Where's the cat? The cat might be upstairs. There's a cat. Somewhere there's a cat. We saw it, yeah, upstairs. I'm going to skip over the one. Okay, so here's the road.
I appreciate that historical.
Here's Rose and if you look at it, it says Rose the Marcel, the man ran photograph, Marcel Duchamp, the rest is alone. And it was Eros, C-R-O-S. C'est la vie, like the names. S-E-L-A-V-Y. So he was posing or photographed as Rose, C-L-V, but it was Eros. Eros. And that was, yes, and that was Man Ray, photographing Duchamp, and this is Bogosian going back to the blink thing. I don't know what the blink is about. And it is a collage, so there, you know, you see, if you get close, we could all look close, you can see this paper over, and this is kind of a map of the water or something. So if you look close, everybody, just walk by, look close, you can see how he.
It's in celestial.
Oh, okay. It is. Yeah. So the blimp has something to do with that. But you can see the edges of the paper. Yeah.
But that's the blue upside down.
Yeah, that's the blue, and this is the.
Yeah.
Yes. Apartments all over it.
Now, what that connection is, Liz, I don't know. But you can see the paper, how he's, you know. Some collages will pull it all together so that you can't see the lines between the paper, and he doesn't use much paint, well, none in here, but sometimes it just all comes together. He's kept every piece and you can see the edges, which is so interesting. Here's another one. These are, and I don't know if you could read them in, like this is bird and butterfly. Target. And I can't read the writing. It's certainly not easy.
Yeah, I think we're going to do that.
Here's a little bit of the
I like it here.
we'll see the more recent work up there.
Well, they got an E and the snake.
The snake,
Adam and Eve,
the devil,
the jester.
the who? The jester.
The stories of life.
Yeah, I guess it is.
It's a wire?
Yeah.
It's wood.
No.
But,
Color it goes. And then you go upstairs and you'll see the owl. Carl's really, which is very. It's scary. I don't really understand that.
can you comment on Robert Vickery? I've always been a fan.
Oh, we're going to talk about him, I think next week.
Oh, next week.
Oh, yeah. And I interviewed him too. I don't remember, he was kind of very reserved. I don't know if I pulled a lot of quotes from him. But his work is that he's like a magic realist.
Yes.
Not interesting in himself. He does this.
We talked about this, didn't we?
Yes.
Yes, last week.
Yeah.
I also was writing, so I'm kind of, they're all blending, but they're going to do, they're planning to do an audio guide for this show. So Benton asked me to, we picked out
The last day of the show?
Right.
I don't know when it's going to get done. Maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever. So, we, a couple days ago, we went around and picked out, he said 15 or 20, where you can make your stops.
Yeah.
So that's what I was doing this morning.
Yeah.
Figuring whichever ones that were the stops on that we picked, I was writing the little blurbs for whoever's going to record it, to record it.
Yep.
So it's all kind of blending on, where I am.
Did you ever interview Joey? Did you ever talk to
No,
him?
no, he was here though, he had a show here.
I had to go, he was so hard to deal with.
Oh, was he? Oh, I think Michael told me
Yeah,
that
so
too.
he had to go to his studio in upstate New York.
Yeah, he was at Long Point,
Whole
yeah.
sort of, for a guy that had such a high self-regard as an artist,
Yeah.
he had terrible frames.
Yeah.
On the page. I don't talk about all artists this way, but
Yeah.
only the bad one. I mean, that's
Yeah.
always just like a big thing with us, having to put work out just to see,
Well, and that
poorly
can
kept.
make things or break.
Poorly
Oh,
kept.
really?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
right. I mean, the backings, all of it was kind of second grade.
No, I mean, I remember seeing him at the show, and I remember the show came, and not many people came. for
That was the Bogosian and Joby was together.
Yeah, and neither of them, oh, Joby was there, but Bogosian was. Bogosian is somebody who's really
Yeah.
kind of a neat guy. And this is, and they're only Sam, the Sam Feinstein.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Marion Hawthorne,
That's a nice one.
Charles's wife. Let's see what else there is. We'll skip over ones we haven't. Did we do clarify?
I think that's at the end.
It's the end.
Yeah.
She wasn't born in 1837. 1937.
Oops.
Oops.
Or maybe that's when it was gifted? Yeah, oh, there's the lifespan, 1837.
Yeah.
And I think they've been doing comma.
No,
and the
but she
date of the-
wasn't
She
born
born in
in.
1837 and died in 2000.
Oh, I see. Oh, right.
She must have been born in 1930.
1937, okay. That would be a miracle.
She's amazing in the lottery.
I think there's some good ones around the corner. Here's a really nice high-end roast. It's a color lithograph. Again, we don't have one of his sculptures, but it really represents, he was very interested in acrobats and figures.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice. Now, he was also full of joy, had lots of fun, touching it out really well.
I've been getting into being a sculptor and then being that kind of a draftsman and then being able to like transfer to
Yeah.
this kind of a lighter, touch.
Yes,
It's
yeah.
pretty amazing.
Yeah. He was, okay, and here are some of the Baskins that we just talked about. Oh, now we can identify them. Here's Malay and Rousseau, Courbet. That's Jack Coughlin.
Jack Coughlin.
That's a different one. And there, so. And those are wood engravings that are done on the hard part of it. Yeah, there's wood cuts that are done on the soft wood. Do you see the grain? The wood engravings are done on very hard wood and.
Where'd you get those fine lines?
Yes, right, exactly, right. This is.
He was teaching me math when I was there.
Yeah, right, yeah, these two, apparently.
I celebrate all of them.
A couple of people did die since we wrote the book.
Okay.
But 1932, he's
And Grello taught you math. I didn't realize that.
Yes.
Do you know when he was teaching?
No, I didn't know. He had retired. He retired in 91. I'm trying to think, I probably interviewed him sometime in the 90s, but it was after.
It was, yeah.
And
I was there, but as an engagement, but totally like him.
Yeah.
I was there with Jack.
Yeah, he must have been good friends with Jack, because Jack taught
Right.
there for 30-some years.
Yeah.
Right,
Right.
yeah,
And they both were in the military.
right.
Right.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
never met.
You didn't meet
No,
Grello,
so
yeah.
he must have
Yeah.
been.
He was a neat guy too. Yeah. Okay, and here are some of the woodcuts that we talked about. This is a wonderful one. We saw this earlier. This is a beautiful white line woodcut by Corita. That's a beautiful one. So here are some of the problems. Most of them were women. I think it's a beautiful one. It's a really good example. It's probably the best color woodcut in the white line woodcut in the museum collection. We'd love to have one by Blanche.
Suzanne Packer is working on a exhibit for down here coming up, explaining the process of white line woodcut, and so I'm photographing it.
I want to, and then I'll show you. There's another Barnett, Will Barnett. He loved cats, but here's a block over here done by. So here's the block.
I've seen it.
I'll move it and everything. That's the actual block.
Odie is his granddaughter.
All right, ready to go, huh? Of course, everything gets reversed when you print it. Yes, right, yes. See how we play with the light and the reflections of the water? No, I missed that. Nice. All right, we're gonna.
That's the floor
Go
shine.
to the first big gallery. And then but this was done in the 20s.
You know, this one reminds me like a Muslim or something like that, only, you know, he did a painter with that.
Yes, right,
With
yes.
that kind of.
Yes,
imagery.
right, yes,
Wasn't
right.
it? Yeah.
And I think one of his paintings was something about war.
Yeah, it is, it's got some kind of.
And there was like kind of signs, letters.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Marston Hartley was a problem.
Oh, he was,
Yeah. Stuart Davis was there early on. Marston Hartley, DeBooth.
Johnson was the other one.
Yeah, they were there. Yeah, they were there around 1916. DeBooth and Hartley were both involved with the Provincetown Players. And DeMuth did some set design or something for the Players, and it was like 1916. So they were there early on.
You know, Jimmy, there's one thing you said to MJ, never thought of before, which just rang true, I don't know if it did for everybody else, was the fact the MFA and the Provincetown, you know, that they never made that connection, like the ships passing in the night, they never grabbed on.
The ferries only run in the summer.
No, seriously, they never grabbed onto that opportunity. Somebody in there, or the staff, or whatever, just never,
Yeah. And I actually kind of told them about it.
I did on a piece of those painters, I don't think. Am I wrong? It went up until recently.
Oh, well, they have some in, yeah. They have, I think, a Motherwell, they have a Kennedy.
Oh,
Yeah, they do have it, but not. But they, you know, with their resources, they could have done a fabulous job. And I think I even wrote a letter, and I spoke to a curator,
yeah.
and it just falls on deaf ears. There's a new, one at a time, there's a new director at the museum now. I may just decide to write to him.
He's supposed to be.
Yeah, he's from Melbourne.
Yes.
Roger's on.
Yeah.
You said great?
No,
Yeah, he is, and he
Right, yeah.
was a brick.
Yeah, but it's very.
So, I mean, they're having the Leonard Chase,
Yeah.
which is, he Butter
Yeah.
worked with him in Shinnecock on Long Island before he opened his school in Provincetown. But they can.
Yeah, that would have been a nice connection too. Yeah.
It's not, he wasn't avant-garde.
No.
Okay, so what else?
Now you get into the support of the FFA. Can you, for me to take as a docent, to take someone, they say to me, tell me more about that. I taught kindergarten, and I could, under my breath, say, well, some of my kindergartners might have done as well, but I wouldn't dare say that.
Well,
So
Motherwell
if you-
said that.
Oh, he did?
Motherwell said the best artists are our children,
Okay.
except for the great artists.
So, I don't have much education about this to go on. So is there any other things you can tell us
Well,
about the composition or anything that I can elaborate?
it's gestural. I mean, you have this back,
It's a good
and
word.
you have, it's very serendipitous, it's very expressionistic.
Expressionistic.
Okay, it comes from, the original one came from automatism and doodling and spontaneity and just expressing the unconscious.
Okay.
So it was pretty free, and you can certainly say that. And yeah, your kindergarten.
Images and so way off.
The first real abstract paintings that, we recognize are around the same time as Freud's first writings.
Okay.
As far as value goes, does it being a print devalue it extremely? I'm sure that the originals are much more.
Oh, yeah.
But,
And this is one of 200, so his prints, though, are selling, depending, I mean, they vary in size, but thousands. And I would guess his big elegies are selling in the millions, obviously. So, yes, there's a big difference, because there are 200 of these somewhere, if he printed them all.
Right.
But he did an edition of 200. This is one of a kind. And that's Fritz Boltmann, and that's the painted gouache that he cut. And you can see it's a collage. And, you can feel, again, he studied with Hoffman. Look at that movement. But look at the detail of it, and yet it is.
It's stunning. I think it's really stunning. It reminds me kind of Rousseau kind of thing.
Yes.
But not exactly. They were little, it's got something else going on there.
It's very eerie.
It's eerie because it's a mystery and they draw you in.
Yeah, they do. That's what he said.
Yeah.
He said they were enigmatic
Yeah.
and provocative.
They're definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, who else? Turn around and look at Headstand, right?
Oh, yes.
You can see from all angles. I didn't even realize that was the face here. I mean, it was there, I saw it there, but it didn't flip with me.
Is that a ceramic head face attached to it?
I think it's all wood. It's very whimsical.
It almost looks like it's separate.
That looks separate. Well, it could be a separate. Or is it? Does anyone want to touch it?
Yeah, it's ceramic.
It's ceramic, isn't it?
Yep.
It doesn't look like it. No, it's ceramic.
Yeah, it's ceramic. You can see the
Yeah.
you can see the clay. Yeah.
It is music. He was a music. It's funny. It has several pieces of wood. Looks like and there's doing the yes. Oh, I love this. There's
The happy family.
When I saw it on the screen, it was really harsh. It was so weird. It's more joyful.
It
When you see it in person, it's a big difference.
It is a big difference. Yeah.
It's strange thing.
Right.
Aren't they all?
Exactly.
And then here is Grello. So then this is a litho. Again, it's edition of 50.
Debbie, question, why do you like this motif, service, dancing, blues? Is there any, why is he
Well, the tango was because he saw the show Tango. Fascinating. The circus. Something that fascinated. And Maryland. And I think that the one Maryland is called something like that. And it is really an image of Maryland on the bandstand, and it was very décolleté. But he did a lot of Marylands. And here you could see in 3 dimensions the Bugsy. Now, if we're going to have a test, someone would have to figure out
Juxtapositions that don't make sense.
No, but what is it? Something for Magritte.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, what is
yeah. Magritte put things together that weren't meant to be together. And this is in honor of the, But there was a,
So what is this?
is that a horse's hoof? That's a horse's hoof, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I thought it was a tool at first.
No, I thought it looked like a hoof in the picture upstairs. Yeah, the leg of the horse is squeezed in the
I think the one I was
vise.
talking about that I saw had
That doesn't have sound.
It does.
yeah. Tony Beavers.
With the stripes.
Cidio from Loonie. Motherwell.
Who's next to Mother?
Joby.
Oh, that's
Oh,
okay.
I think it's so cheerful.
Doesn't he?
Yeah,
He's
having a good
like
time.
that,
And I
They all
think that's
party.
Dimitri Hosdy. I'm not sure. But wait.
Leo
Who's the
Manson.
woman?
Oh, no, they're all names.
Oh, it's Leo Manso.
Manson.
Oh, it's here. It is here. Someone said it was.
Leo Manso, oh, Peter Manso's father.
Yes, right. I didn't even recognize
That's
him.
Norris Spare.
That's the other thing with this.
Norris
It's
Spire.
the world of, you know, good
This
sons,
is
grandsons,
Judith
granddaughters.
Rush.
No.
It is.
Oh, so that.
Front row is Robert Motherwell. Joby, although it is Leo Manso, and that's Nora. No, I interviewed Nora. That's Norris.
That's
Yeah.
one.
They must be reversed.
So the woman is Judith Rothschild.
Up there in the middle,
Yeah.
and that's Norris Spire.
Who was
And
her husband? His father's husband?
above her, Cidio from Loonie.
That name you have to spell.
I didn't even see that there.
Yeah.
Hey, where's Paul Russell? He's in the.
Cidio from Loonie, that's a name. Couldn't find it.
Oh, right, because it's not there.